Hi, Pastor Palmer here again. Welcome back. So, what an exciting journey we've been on so far. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and now this session on understanding racial and ethnic disparities. Why are there racial and ethnic disparities is the question, right? And when I say racial and ethnic disparities, I'll begin to use the acronym RED, right? So a number of forces work together to contribute what we call contributing mechanisms to racial and ethnic disparities. So we're going to look at some of those contributing mechanisms. It's also important for system work to look inward to identify what factors are most significantly influencing your RED outcomes. And instead of looking outward and oftentimes looking to blame the individuals experiencing the disparities, it's important that we take a look inward and think about our systems and what in our systems could be contributing to these disparities and these disproportionate outcomes that we see, and then seek to initiate steps to address these disparities. And then there's several things that can contribute to racial and ethnic disparities. Things like justice by geography. We'll talk about each of these terms. Indirect effects, differential treatment, things like data aberration and differential offending. We'll unwrap these terms as we move forward, beginning with justice by geography and indirect effects. So when we talk about justice by geography, we're talking about things like the different policies that may span the same city or the same geographic location. Sometimes we have different policies on one side of town versus the other side of town. And a lot of times these policies are influenced by socioeconomic dynamics. Oftentimes they're harsher in areas that are predominantly populated by minorities. I remember spending a year with the Louisville Metro Police Department training on implicit bias, and often the police officers themselves would tell me how we police across our jurisdictions is different, say from one side of town versus another side of town. Same police department, but different impacts of policy, right? And then there's local policy, sometimes also policies that are adversely affecting certain people in certain demographics of the same city or same state. There are policies that we have in our urban centers that are not necessarily the same policies that are enforced in some of our more rural suburban areas. And then when we talk about indirect effects, this one is very simple. We're talking about those things that affect individuals when they come in contact with our justice system that those individuals have no control over. Things like poverty, right? There are certain things that are associated with poverty that individuals can't control. There are crimes. Sometimes we have to deal with policies in cities that criminalize what is normal behavior for people who are homeless, for instance, right? So there's policies that affect racial and ethnic disparities, and folks can't control that. Family dynamics. Sometimes folks coming in contact with our system can't control those things, right? Socioeconomic factors, right? Housing and community construct are all indirect effects. Sometimes things held against people that they don't necessarily have control over. And then when we talk about differential treatment, this one is simple, right? It defines that framework perspective that generally concentrates on structural decision-making acts and how they differentially impact some, right? Sometimes we see people similarly situated in our system, and yet we see some people experience one outcome versus others. We have tons of research that suggests that sometimes people similarly situated experience different outcomes in our system. We call this differential treatment. This perspective argues that minorities are most likely to suffer some of the more harsher outcomes in our systems compared to their white counterparts. We see this throughout our juvenile justice system. We see this throughout our child welfare system. We see this same phenomenon happening in our adult criminal justice system. And then there's data aberration, right? This one also is one of those things. It's very simple, right? The data is simply noise, right? We get the data and we don't believe the data, or we suggest that the data is skewed somehow, right? I heard somebody say to me one time when I was presenting the data that their statistical analysis department gave me, your data makes us sound as if we're racist. And I had to correct that. It's not my data, it's your data. And then I had a person correct me one time and said, you can make that data say whatever you want it to say. And I agree. Let's make it say that we're not disproportionately detaining African American kids compared to their white counterparts who are similarly situated, right? So data aberration. Sometimes we ignore the data, sometimes we don't believe the data, right? It's that approach and that perspective that we take that the data is not significantly revealing to us where we may have racial and ethnic disparities. Then there's differential offending. Differential offending defines this framework that centers on the individual offender and not necessarily the system. This argument typically blames those minority populations experience disproportionality and disparate outcomes as a cause of their disproportionate representation. This perspective requires that causes differential involvement is what really is the argument. Somehow that certain groups are more inclined to certain behaviors, right? Differential offending perspective oftentimes ignores sometimes what the data suggests about these offending patterns and the fact that oftentimes all groups offend at similar rates, and yet we have differential involvement. So differential treatment or offending really deals with this idea that somehow people offend at differential rates. So as we look at these data slides, I want you to look at the disproportionate representation and some of the disparate outcomes. This slide here deals with street policing and the likelihood of being stopped by police. That chart on the left is, of course, just shows general population stats. But then we look at people stopped by police on the street. We see African Americans at 12% of the population, represented about 18% of those folks stopped, and Hispanics slightly underrepresented at 15%, and Caucasians slightly underrepresented as well at 60%. But then when we look at those who are more inclined to call police and seek help from police, we see Caucasians overrepresented and both the Hispanic population and the African population underrepresented in those populations of people that are most likely to reach out to police for help. And then when we look at those having contact with police and those who actually experience use of force. And look at this particular chart here. Roughly 11.5% African Americans that had some contact with police, but roughly about 20% that experienced use of force. Whites at 70% of those who had contact with police, but a significant decrease in the amount that actually had police use force at 47%. And then when we look at that never had contact with police versus, or rather never been arrested in the previous year compared to those who have been arrested one time, compared to those who have been arrested multiple times. And again, look at how this chart progresses. Again, blacks are 12% of those who have no arrests or bookings within the previous year. But then 21% of those who have had at least one booking in the previous year. And that jumps up to 28% when we look at multiples. We see the same for Hispanics, but we see the opposite for Caucasians. They continue to decrease, right? When we look at incarceration rates, right? 592 per 100,000 for African Americans compared to just 182 for Hispanics and 187 for whites. And then when we look at disproportionality in our pretrial arena, again, look at African Americans and Hispanics. More than half of those who are represented in that pretrial population, African American and Hispanics. African Americans at 43%. Okay, remember, they're just about 12% of the U.S. population, and yet 43% of our pretrial population. And then when we look at this chart, males versus females, when it comes to detained, you can see how socioeconomics play a role, right? Again, those who are less resourced often are the ones that disproportionately, both male and female, and the group that is experiencing the greatest challenge when it comes to socioeconomics and being able to fund their freedom. We see African American males and African American females, of course, having the worst outcomes. And then when we look at those that are in prison, again, we see African American males and African American females, of course, representing, again, those that are poor when you compare their income, both to the incarcerated population and the not incarcerated population. So, and I want to encourage you as you go through this slide deck to pause the video and really take these slides in. For time, I'm kind of running through them relatively quick, but I want you to take time to look at that. And then we look at racial disparities in our prison incarceration population. Again, look at the disparities of African-American men compared to the others in this group, right? Hispanics at just over 1,000 per 100,000, whites at 372. But for African-American men, over 2,000 per 100,000. And then we see African-American women slightly elevated compared to their white and their Hispanic counterparts. And then when we look at those serving life without parole in our system, African-Americans are roughly 13%, but they're 48%, nearly half of the people in our prison systems that are serving life without parole come from one of those smallest populations of groups in our society. Caucasians at 61% of the general population represent roughly about 32% of life without parole. And Hispanics are slightly underrepresented at just 16%. So one of the worst outcomes in our system, significant overrepresentation for African Americans. And then when we look at, again, death row, African Americans at 13% are dead even in their percentage with whites at 42% of those serving death row. And again, Hispanics slightly underrepresented. So African Americans, that very small population, experiencing to a significant degree those worst outcomes. And then when we look at those in solitary confinement, again, looking at the total prison populations, African American are roughly 43% of the total prison population. But they're 46%, the men, they're 46% of the men in confinement. And African American women are roughly 23% of our prison population, but they represent over 40% of the women in solitary confinement. And then when we look at unemployment, so all things being equal, serving time, getting out of the system, but look at this chart, right? The unemployment rate, so much higher for African-American men and women compared to white men and women post incarceration. So significant decrease in even some of the post-incarceration consequences. And then when we look at homeless, again, when we look at the homeless population, formerly incarcerated versus those who are incarcerated. So the homeless rate for the general population in America is about 21 per 100,000. But then when we look at that homeless rate for those who are formerly incarcerated, that goes up to over 200 per 100,000. But then when we break it down by gender, it's roughly 264 for women. And then when we look at those who are formerly incarcerated women. And then for men, about 195. But look at the disparity when we break it even further down by race. For African Americans, 240 per 100,000. For Hispanics, 191. And for whites, 148. So even with all things being equal, African Americans are most likely going to have the worst outcomes, even post incarceration. This is a very interesting chart because it deals with socioeconomics. And what I want you to look at is where African Americans are compared to whites. Look at whites that were never incarcerated and their accumulation of wealth, up near 125,000. For Hispanics, never incarcerated, that's somewhere around 50,000. But look at blacks never incarcerated. The blacks that are never incarcerated is below whites at level of income post-incarceration. So this chart is very telling because, again, we see those consequences, those disadvantages and those disparities at arrest and with incarceration. We now see it infecting people beyond the incarceration period. So there's some things I want you to consider as we look at identifying racial and ethnic disparity. This needs to become a normal process of looking at our data and considering whether or not our data reveals the possibility that we have disparities based on race, based on ethnicity, based on gender, sexual identification, based on socioeconomic factors, right? So here's some things I'd like for you to consider between now and our next session. So we talked about those possible explanations for racial and ethnic disparities. So now I want to challenge you to look at your data, look at policies within your organization, and maybe even some policies and practices of some of those organizations that impact those who come into contact with your organization. And ask the question, is there justice by geography happening with the client population? If so, those clients experiencing justice by geography, where do they live? Are there policies and practices with other system stakeholders that you think may be impacting disproportionality of certain populations within your system? Are there justice by geography policies and practices being utilized in some of your processes, right? Do you see cases being handled different within your jurisdictions? Is there differential treatment? Do you see some getting one response versus others? I want you to think about policies and practice, not only of your own organization, but some of those other system stakeholders that you interact with. And ask yourself a question, is there differential treatment or differential processing happening? Is there data aberration that impacts some of the disparities that you see? Are people ignoring sometimes the data that suggests disproportionate impact or disparate outcomes for certain populations? That's the question I want you to ask as you go back and look at some of the data that your organization produces. And then what about differential offending, right? Is there this idea within stakeholders within your own organization that certain populations are just inclined to criminality? Is there this idea that people offend at different rates? Now, as you discover some of these things exist, right, then I want you to seek the research and the data that will explain. Sometimes that research, sometimes that localized data will give credibility to that anecdotal perspective. Sometimes it will discount it. It will help you to realize that that's not the problem. But the challenge is to start the conversation, start your own internal investigations, start looking at your data to discover where racial and ethnic disparity is occurring in your system. So again, another step towards this process of understanding racial ethnic disparities and this conversation around equity and inclusion. Thank you all. I look forward to our next session. Goodbye.